She had kept quiet for a very long time. While the whole world was busy putting her father on a pedestal, calling him a legend, a genius, a saint with a movie star face, she stayed silent. She watched the tributes roll in. She watched strangers cry over a man they had never met. She watched Hollywood turn her father into a symbol, something polished and perfect and untouchable. But Melissa Newman knew things about Paul Newman that no documentary ever captured and no magazine ever printed. She knew the man who came home tired and distant. She knew the weight he carried and tried so hard to hide. And now, at 63 years old, after years of holding it all inside, she has finally opened up. And what she has shared will completely change the way you see one of Hollywood's greatest stars. But before we get into what Melissa revealed, we have to go back to the beginning. Because to understand what she is saying now, you first have to understand where Paul Newman came from, what shaped him, and what haunted him from the very start. Paul Leonard Newman was born on January 26, 1925, in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. His family was comfortable. His father ran a well-known sporting goods store, and they lived in a nice suburb called Shaker Heights. To anyone looking from the outside, it looked like a happy, successful American family. But even as a young boy, Paul felt like he didn't quite belong. The neighborhood was mostly Christian, and because his father was Jewish, Paul was quietly pushed to the edges of things. He was once turned away from a school group simply because of his father's religion. That kind of rejection, especially when you are young and just figuring out who you are, leaves a mark that doesn't fade easily. It made Paul feel like an outsider before he even had the words to describe what that meant. And that feeling, that deep, uncomfortable sense of not quite fitting in, would follow him for the rest of his life in ways he never fully talked about. But something wonderful was also growing inside him during those early years. At just 7 years old, he stepped onto a stage for the very first time and played Robin Hood in a school play. Something woke up in him that day. Not ambition, not a plan, just pure joy. Acting was the one place where Paul felt completely free. He kept doing it through school, through local theater groups, through everything he could find. It gave him something the real world wasn't giving him. It gave him a place to belong. Then the war came and changed everything. Paul enlisted in the Navy with dreams of becoming a pilot. But a colorblind test ended that plan before it even started. Instead, he was trained as a radio operator on torpedo bombers. By 1945, he found himself in Hawaii with his unit, ready to ship out on the USS Bunker Hill, heading straight into one of the most dangerous battles of the Pacific. But at the very last moment, his pilot came down with an ear infection. Their crew was held back. Days later, kamikaze pilots attacked the Bunker Hill and killed hundreds of men, including many from Paul's unit. He had been inches away from death. That kind of experience rewires a person. It makes everything feel different. It makes you ask why you were spared when others were not. And for Paul Newman, that question never fully went away. He spent the rest of his life trying to answer it with action. After the war, Paul went back to college. Then his father died suddenly, and the family business landed on his shoulders. For 18 long months he ran that sporting goods store, showing up every day to a life that felt completely wrong for him. He later said he wasn't stepping into the role of businessman. He was running away from himself inside it. So in 1951, he made a bold and frightening decision. He left Cleveland, walked away from the store, and went to study drama at Yale. He wasn't even sure he was talented enough to act. He thought maybe he could direct instead, stay behind the camera where the risk felt smaller. But the pull toward performing was too strong to resist. He moved to New York and trained under Lee Strasberg at the famous actor studio, learning how to reach inside himself and pull out emotions that most people spend their whole lives trying to bury. And slowly, almost painfully, Paul Newman began to become someone the world would never forget. His first real break came in 1953 with a Broadway play called Picnic. It wasn't the lead role, but it put him in front of packed theaters night after night. And it was backstage at that very same show where the most important and most complicated chapter of his personal life quietly began. Because backstage at Picnic, Paul Newman met Joanne Woodward. He was already married with 3 children at home. But something passed between them that he could not explain and could not walk away from. They tried to stay apart for 4 years. They tried to do the right thing. Then in 1957, they were cast together in the same film, and the distance became impossible to keep. Paul's first marriage ended. In 1958, he and Joanne were married in a quiet ceremony in Las Vegas, and they flew to England for their honeymoon, hoping to leave the guilt and the whispered judgments behind. They never fully managed it. Paul knew he had hurt people, especially his children, from his first marriage. That knowledge lived in him quietly, like a stone in his chest that never moved. And it shaped everything that came after. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Paul Newman became one of the most recognized men on the planet. He played characters with a bruised, restless energy that felt achingly real, because it was real. In Cool Hand Luke, he played a man who refused to be crushed by a system that was designed to break him. In The Hustler, he played someone brilliant and reckless and deeply lonely all at once. In HUD, he played a man with charm that hit a hollow center. Audiences kept coming back because they sensed something true beneath the performance. Those blue eyes of his became legendary. But behind them was a man quietly battling the same things his characters battled. Doubt, guilt, the feeling of never quite being enough no matter how much success piled up around him. He once wrote in his own memoir that fame felt like a costume he wore, something that looked impressive from a distance, but never really fit when he was alone with himself. And this is where Melissa's story begins to cut the deepest. Paul Newman, the movie star, and Paul Newman, the father, were not the same person. Fame is hungry. It takes up time and attention and emotional energy that should go to the people closest to you. His daughters grew up watching a man who poured himself into his career, his charities, his racing, his causes, while the family dinner table sometimes sat without him. Melissa saw it. She lived it. But she also saw something else. She saw him try. She saw him become aware of what he was missing and work hard to change it, especially after the worst moment of his life arrived without warning. In 1978, Paul's son Scott from his first marriage died of a drug overdose at just 28 years old. The tabloids called it a Hollywood tragedy and moved on quickly. But for Paul, it was something far more devastating than grief. He felt it as a punishment. Like the years of distance between him and Scott had built a wall that could never be torn down now. He had not been the father Scott needed. He knew it. And now there was no more time to fix it. He didn't talk about it openly. He couldn't find the words. Instead, he did what he always did when something was too painful to say out loud. He turned the pain into action. Within months, he created the Scott Newman Center, a foundation dedicated to teaching young people about the dangers of drugs. It was the closest thing to an apology he could offer to a son who could no longer hear him. But the guilt did not leave. It settled into the walls of their Connecticut home. It changed the way the family breathed together. Melissa once said quietly that her parents were never quite the same after Scott died. The loss did not destroy them, but it hollowed something out that never fully grew back. What Melissa wanted the world to know, and what she finally found the courage to share, is that her father spent the years after Scott's death trying harder than he ever had before. He became more present. He showed up at the kitchen table. He helped cook. He listened. He chose film roles more carefully and gave more of himself to the people right in front of him rather than the cameras pointed at him. He wasn't perfect. He never pretended to be. But the effort was real, and it meant everything to the daughters who watched it happen. Melissa put together a deeply personal photo book called Head Over Heels, filled with private images from her parents' life together. Not award ceremonies, not red carpets, real life. Her father gently pinching her mother's waist as he walked through the kitchen. The two of them out early on a quiet morning fishing together. Gardens and long dinners and small tender moments that nobody ever staged for a photographer. She wanted people to see the man she actually knew, not the polished legend the world had decided he was. Paul Newman passed away on September 26, 2008, at his home in Westport, Connecticut, with Joanne holding his hand. He was 83. He had been fighting lung cancer privately for months, the way he handled most hard things, without asking anyone to feel sorry for him. He left behind a food company that had given over $570 million to charity. He left behind a racing career that shocked everyone who thought it was just a hobby. He left behind films that will still be watched long after every person alive today is gone. But what he left his daughters was something harder to measure. A legacy of love that was tangled up with absence and regret and the slow, humble effort of a man trying to become better before his time was up. After his death, the family's pain did not end quietly. Paul had left control of his estate to advisors outside the family, and what followed was years of tension, distrust, and heartbreak. His daughter Susan told a major publication that not a single member of the Newman family had faith in how the estate was being handled. The family believed the values Paul had built his life around were being ignored. They felt the company he had poured his heart into was drifting away from everything he stood for. A clause in Paul's own will made it nearly impossible for them to challenge any of it legally without losing their inheritance. It was a trap none of them had seen coming. The advisor at the center of it was eventually removed in 2019 following separate misconduct allegations. But the damage to the family's trust had already been done, and healing from it has been a long and quiet road. Through all of it, Melissa has chosen a different path. Not loud fights in the press, not angry interviews, just the steady, honest work of keeping her father's real story alive. Because the real story is not about the blue eyes or the Oscar nominations or the famous salad dressing on grocery store shelves. The real story is about a man who grew up feeling like an outsider and spent his whole life searching for a place to belong. A man who loved deeply but sometimes badly. A man who lost his son and let that loss reshape him. A man who sat at the kitchen table in Connecticut in his final years and simply tried to be present for the people he loved most. At 63, Melissa Newman is not just honoring a name. She is telling the full truth about a father who was complicated and human and worth understanding completely. And if you have ever loved someone like that, someone who hurt you and tried to fix it, someone who was bigger than life to the world, but achingly ordinary at home, then Paul Newman's story is not just a story. It is yours too. That is why it still matters. That is why we are still here talking about him. If this story reached something inside you, hit the like button right now and subscribe so you never miss the real stories behind the legends the world thinks it already knows.